Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I want to go ahead and do a sound check in the chat. If you can let me know if you can hear me and see the slides, that would be great. Awesome. I think we're all really good at Zoom meetings now, so good to know that you can see and hear us. Excellent. I want to welcome you all to this conversation on alternative academic roles. We're really excited to have you here, but also admittedly are coming with heavy hearts as well. This is a difficult week, a difficult several months for many of us, but particularly because of the rise in anti-racist action this week, we know that many of us are coming tired and really maybe struggling with a lot of emotions. So we want to thank you for taking time to be here with us, and also just offer a note of solidarity for that anti-racist work from each of us. So I'm Dr. Katie Linder. I'm here with my colleagues Tom and Kevin, and we co-authored a book that came out in January of this year on alternative academic careers. Tom, do you want to say hello and introduce yourself?
Hi, everybody. I'm Dr. Tom Tobin. I am the Director of Distance Teaching and Learning for the Learning, Design, Development, and Innovation team at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. It's a long title, but in short, I help people to learn how to teach. So I'm looking forward to our conversation today. And I'll pass it over to our colleague, Kevin, as well.
Hi, everybody. I'm Dr. Kevin Kelly, and like my colleagues, I'm grateful for you all being here. I am a higher education consultant and teach as a lecturer faculty member at San Francisco State University. So I'm excited to join you all today.
All right, so we would also love for everyone here to also introduce yourselves in the chat. We definitely would love to have a robust back channel. Feel free to ask additional questions as we're presenting today, but we'd love to hear where you're logging in from. Feel free to share if you want your position or anything that you think might be helpful for the group to know, so we get a sense of who's here. And we did have almost, I think, over 100 questions that were submitted from everyone as they registered for this event. And so we did comb through those. We found the ones that seemed to have the most, kind of prevalence within that group. We grouped them into several different questions. And we are also going to be open to additional questions happening in the chat. So we're going to do the best we can to get through as much as we can. But we thought we would start with just some quick definitions to get everyone on the same page about what we're thinking about when it comes to alternative academic roles. And so this is a diagram that we have in the book. And this is basically kind of separating out what we consider to be academic roles, alternative academic roles, and what we call non-academic roles. And this gives you a sense of what these look like along the career stage. And so this is a rough approximation. I want to be clear about that because there's a lot of different ways that we could kind of slice and dice this. But when we think about academic roles, we're typically thinking about tenure track or kind of more traditional instruction research roles where you're using your PhD in the track that maybe was your original plan or what's been defined for a long time as being an academic role within the academy. Alternative academic roles are what we all have, Tom and Kevin and I. These are things that are kind of adjacent in many ways to that faculty role, still using our PhD, still using a lot of the skills that we developed in our graduate educations, but we're also kind of working within higher ed or adjacent to higher ed in various ways. And then on the non-academic side is when you might have work that's outside of the academy, but is still using that PhD, still using those skills that you learned as a graduate student. So that could be in a nonprofit, it could be in a government or industry position. So lots of possibilities there of what that could look like. But really in the book, what we're trying to emphasize is this really broad spectrum of what you can do when it comes to an academic role, a non-academic role, an alternative academic role. There's a lot of possibilities here. So we know the diagram is not exhaustive, but hopefully it gives you a bit of a sense of what some of the options are here. And I know some of you in the room are probably also in alternative academic roles right now and know this place very well. Okay, so let's shift into today's discussion. So we had a series of categories from today's discussion, and we had questions in all of these categories. And we're going to alternate who answers each question and let the other two folks who are presenting be available in the chat to moderate if there's additional comments or questions that come through. So we're going to start with an answer on grad school decisions from Tom.
Thank you, Katie. A lot of the questions that we got before our session began had to do with, okay, I'm in graduate school and I know that my chances of landing a tenure track faculty job are kind of slim. And if I'm not in a school that is a super powerhouse for placing those tenure track people, how do I prepare myself? What do I do? So on your screen, you see a number of graduate students who are sitting around a meeting table, drinking coffee. They have books, they have snacks, they have phones, are all set for a conversation. And we'd like to surface on the screen a couple of questions. If I go for a PhD and can't secure that tenured position, will I still feel like the PhD was worth it? And an associated question, how do I get credibility and alternative academic capital in my discipline if I don't have a PhD yet? The good news is that the PhD prepares you, regardless of the field in which you study, prepares you for a lot of different kinds of work. And if the people who are advising you, and we'll talk about this later, if they're talking only about going into a faculty job, one of the things you can do is, as you are studying, to find opportunities for reaching out to people who are doing alternative academic work. In the book, we go into this a little further, but I want to give an example. I was working on my PhD many years ago and got a job working at a community college to help them put together online courses. This was back in the late 1990s, and I was an English PhD, right? So I wasn't a computer science person or an instructional designer. In fact, the degrees didn't even exist at that point. But because I could code HTML and because I knew database management, I got the job there. And my humanities background was actually a real asset because I could talk shop with the people who were teaching in the business area, the sciences, and the humanities at that college. Now, fast forward to today's job market. And if you're a graduate student now, look to talk with, interview, have coffee with, when we can all go have coffee again, with the people who are doing the work that looks interesting to you, but isn't directly necessarily related to your program. So gaining that credibility and alternative academic capital, that's a way of doing networking for yourself. And will the PhD still feel like it was worth it? I can't actually answer that question for everybody. At the same time, I've always thought that the PhD, having that credential opens doors for you, whether you're looking in industry and you're coming to them and say, oh, I have a doctorate and I know how to do all these kinds of skills. We're going to talk about how to translate academics into industry in a couple of minutes here. But having that doctorate opens doors for you, whether it's in whatever discipline or what have you. So that PhD decision to keep going, that's entirely up to you. But at the same time, having it will open doors. And with that, I want to turn it over to Katie to talk a little bit about preparations before you go alt-ac.
Thanks, Tom. Okay, so one of the other big questions we got was top pieces of advice for alternative academic preparation during the final year of the degree, or as you're getting kind of close to graduating. What are some things that you can be doing to really prepare yourself to go on the market? So I want to emphasize one of the things that Tom said in his response, which is this idea of informational interviewing. This is a great time to start talking with other people, and sometimes networking can feel a little bit uncomfortable. I'm an introvert, so it's not always one of my favorite things, but having informational interviews is actually a really fantastic way of doing that kind of more informal networking, learning about other people's backgrounds, learning about what their jobs are really like, and really getting a sense of if alternative academic positions in a range of different fields might be a fit for you. So that's one of the things that I think would be a really good thing to consider. And there's a lot of also kind of more lurking ways of doing this that we talk about in the book, like reading blog posts and following people on social media who do this kind of work. So if you're not really that set up a Zoom call kind of person, there's other ways, I think, to kind of lurk a little bit and find out what's going on in these positions. I also think that the final year of grad school is a really great time to branch out in terms of the kind of work experience that you might pursue. So you might have spent the majority of your grad school career doing a research assistantship, doing teaching of some kind. Consider shifting into like an advising role or a more administrative role in student affairs or the grad school office or something in faculty development, which was the pathway that I ended up taking. This broader experience on your CV or your resume really allows you to talk about applying a really wide range of skills in a lot of different spaces. And it just gives you exposure to different kinds of positions. So if you have flexibility around that, I would encourage it. And this is something that was not, really supported, at least in the beginning, by my advisor. She was very concerned when I went down this pathway, but I was one of the only people in my cohort that got a job outside of grad school. And that really changed everybody's tune. They saw kind of the value of doing this kind of administrative work later in the grad school career. And advising, I know, is also really something that if you're still thinking about a faculty role, can be really positive to have on your CV as well. The last thing I would suggest in response to this question is to get really clear on what your professional values are. And this is something that I feel like we don't really discuss in the higher ed space as much as we should, and especially at the grad school level. And so I think if you have time to kind of really reflect on this and understand what you care about the most in your future career, what you think your contributions will be, what are the kinds of things that you can share, that's something that's really important work to be doing. So I do have a resource for that I found recently. It's a book available on Amazon that really gets you into thinking about what your values are. Oh, I just dropped the wrong link in. Hang on. I just gave you a link for forming an LLC, which may not be as relevant to some of you, but could be relevant for this idea of alternative academic careers. The second link is the book on Amazon. So I think that is another piece that's really key when you're thinking about that final year, and what your values are can be really important. I'm going to pass it over to Kevin for the next question.
Well, thank you, Katie. And you heard both of them describe kind of the different considerations as you start looking around the world for jobs. And Tom even mentioned the word job market. And so I wanted to share a couple of ideas about getting to know that market a little better, especially when, to put it plainly, the job market is fairly fluid right now. And so one is an idea that Katie referenced, reading up on what other people are saying. And so I would say, for example, Nicole Barbaro, BC, before COVID-19, she wrote an article about the all-tech job market in January. And she gave some strategies for what it might be like for us to do, and focusing on things like figuring out what you'd like to do, filtering your searches by things like industry and geography, or talking to people in jobs that interest you, the idea that Katie mentioned about informational interviews. So that's one way to think about the process of going about identifying the job market and what's available. When you want to actually scan the environment, there are a number of sites related to finding different positions. And so I wanted to share a couple ideas with you. There's the article for Nicole. And then here are a couple of higher ed job sites. One is called Higher Ed Jobs, higheredjobs.com. And the other is the Higher Ed Recruitment Consortium, or HERCjobs.org. In the book itself, we have quite a few more, and not all of them have higher ed in the title of the sites. And so you can identify different geography locations where you would like to live, or find things that are around where you live now so you don't have to move, and also find positions that might be outside the academic pathway that Katie outlined in that first slide for our presentation. Another thing you can do is ask for support. Different campuses, especially if you're still in graduate school, have hosted events to support grad students. UNLV just in late May had an alternative career opportunities post-COVID-19 event. And so one recommendation that I have is to contact your campus career center, share this link and say, hey, I'd like to have something similar. If you've already graduated, then you might find a professional organization, which I'm sure we'll be talking about in more depth later, that might have some guidance for people who are members about what the industry looks like. Ultimately, when the world is stable, things don't change as much, but when they're more chaotic, like we have now, new opportunities arise and you want to be ready to take advantage of them. So the last thing I'll bring up is a few short-term considerations for today's world. Specifically, what jobs can be done on ground or virtually. When we get to topics related to skill sets, Tom used the word translating skills that we'll get to much later in this program. We'll go into more depth, but you'll want to be looking out for roles that call for or allow for working remotely, virtual teamwork, things like that. Ultimately, we want to keep sight of your overall goals, but some of these considerations play a factor as you assess the job market. So I'm going to hand the talking stick back over to my colleagues for our next topic.
All right, so our next question is really getting at folks who are working with graduate students in maybe some kind of advising capacity, really trying to think about how to support graduate students or colleagues as they're thinking about moving in this direction. And there are so many resources available now on alternative academic positions, and particularly those that are in the academic space or adjacent to the academic space. We've seen so many blogs, we've seen so many disciplinary organizations create resources around this. A good example is the MLA. There's many others who have done this work. So I think that it's pretty easy to even start Googling and kind of get into a space where you're starting to understand what the possibilities are. But I would echo what Kevin said, in that you don't have to do this alone. And so I have a few suggestions for kind of how to support grad students and not feel like you have to do it on your own, especially if your career has only been in the academic space. So if you're thinking like, I don't know how to support grad students, all I've ever been is a tenure track faculty member, that's a tough thing. I mean, you're not necessarily going to understand the alternative academic space. So I'm going to echo Kevin's suggestion to partner with the Career Center. I think the Career Center often is very kind of positioned well to help with these kinds of resources. And when I was in grad school, I actually met with a career counselor who was helping me think through my job materials, how to interview, how to negotiate my first job offer. And I actually got the call for my first job offer when I was in the office with the career counselor. Like, they were sitting next to me when I got the call, and I took the call with them right there. So I have very fond memories of the Career Center and how helpful they can be to these kinds of searches. So I think partnering with them, seeing what their resources are, what kind of workshops they might offer, is a great way to think about this. I would also consider hosting a panel. And this is something that I know I've been involved in. I think Kevin and Tom may be involved with this with either their alum institutions or other institutions, where you bring in folks who have alternative academic careers, host a virtual panel, have them talk about what they do and how they got into those spaces. And I would imagine in many departments now, you have alums who are in this space. So this also goes for folks who are in the room who are in a grad student position. Ask who the alums are who are doing this work and who are in alternative academic careers, and get connected through your departments. So that would be another way to think about that. And then the other thing I would say is you can offer some kind of workshop. And this could be in partnership with the Career Center. It could also be in partnership with somebody from outside the institution who does this kind of work. Really early in my consulting career, I used to do these kinds of workshops, and I went to a school where we were talking about job letters and CVs, and basically found that the students were being given like the opposite information that they should have been given about how much they should talk about their dissertations and their cover letters and things like that. And in alternative academic roles, you don't often have to talk about your dissertation. That's not really something that's as valuable as in a tenure track position application. And they were being kind of advised in really wrong directions. And so I think that having somebody who has the experience of being on search committees for alternative academic roles, or who has applied for many of those positions and can lead some kind of workshop giving tips and strategies, is going to be really important as well. So that's another option here. Okay, passing the talking stick back over to Tom.
Thank you, Katie. And Katie was just talking about how our advisors can advise graduate students, I want to actually talk to the people who are advising graduate students, to new people in the field, everybody here on the session. And the question that we're going to talk about here is networking. This is not the sort of icky, schmoozy 50 people in a room and I feel really awkward and I just want to go back to the hotel room with Netflix kind of networking. What we're talking about here is how do you make meaningful connections within your field as well as outside of and adjacent to your field. So especially because we've got hiring freezes, we've got canceled conferences, what can you do to expand your network and find opportunities? Well, I'd like to talk about 3 different ways that you can support yourself, find other people in a not icky way, and reach out and make connections. So for example, Katie and Kevin and I, and Patrick Walsh says he gets the exact same advice. Your dissertation is all you have to show for your time in graduate school. And then he put the eye roll into the chat. So awesome. I love that feedback for what Katie's talking about. And what Patrick's saying here in the chat is actually one of the pieces that I want to highlight. Let me tell you a story. Katie and Kevin and I came together because Katie had the idea for this book and she thought, well, who are the other people who are doing all-tax stuff and writing about it? And she ended up connecting with me and with Kevin individually. And together we figured out, well, we want to write this book together. And that was one of the ways. I had known Katie for a couple of years prior to that, but I didn't know Kevin at all before. And we wrote this book together as a way of creating a community around these questions and topics. Now, you're probably not to the point where you just pick up the phone and go, hey, you're an expert, work with me. So if we're thinking about networking, the first place that I'd encourage everybody to go is Twitter. And I'm going to put it into the chat. This is Katie's handle, Kevin's handle, and my handle. If you are following hashtags like hashtag higher ed, like hashtag support services, hashtag alt-ac, just ALTAC, no hyphens in hashtags, remember. If you're following those hashtags, you'll find, thank you, Kevin, for putting that in the chat, you'll find a lot of opportunities for working with other folks and networking with them in a way that is based on shared ideas and shared goals. The second place to go is if you have a blog or you're writing about your experiences in your field and even your experiences of the search. I want to surface a rock star who's here on the session with us. It's Jennifer Polk from Beyond the PhD. And she started out just doing writing about her experiences, and other people who were then graduate students said, hey, your writing really helped me to understand my own predicament, challenges, and needs, and could you help me with it? And it turned into a business for her. It turned into consulting and conversations like the one we're having here. And the other piece that you can do for networking as a way in these COVID times when you're not going to conferences in person is join your institution's or your field's professional organization. For Katie and Kevin and me, we're in teaching and learning center spaces at our institutions. And so we are members of the Professional and Organizational Development Network. That's POD Network. And I'll stick that actually down here, podnetwork.org. Kevin beat me to it, but I'll put it in too. And that has been a wonderful place for us to meet other people who do what we do or do what we want to do eventually when we were graduate students and just new members of the field. So those are a few places in the book. We have a lot more in there, but I want to turn it back over to Katie, who's going to talk a little bit about, now that you've done some networking, how do you actually do the job search?
Okay, so we got a lot of questions around how to kind of keep your options open when it comes to going on the job market, not overwhelming yourself when it comes to going on the job market, and the kinds of materials that you should be creating to support your alternative academic job search. So I wanted to address these questions kind of as a group. I think one of the things that is the most important about creating options for yourself is really having a deep understanding of your strengths and your skills. This is going to allow you to really translate those things into a range of different possible positions and fields if you have a deep awareness of what you can do and what you can offer. And I think it will allow you to think creatively when you're looking at different job postings about what is going to be a good fit for you. The other thing I would say too is, and I know this is kind of hard to think about this in our current job climate, but you get to be picky too. Like, I think this is about really thinking about what you want, what you think you would be a good fit for, what would advance your career, what would really allow you to shine, and having a sense of what your priorities are when it comes to the job market. And this is even, very true for people who are transitioning jobs and trying to find something that's maybe different than what they're currently in. I recently changed jobs about 4 months ago, and I was looking for something kind of unique. I really wanted something that would allow me to be creative, that would allow me to have autonomy. And so I waited. I really was like looking for the job, and I applied for one and I got that job, and great. I mean, like, I knew what I wanted and I had a very clear sense of my skills and how they might apply to that job. So I think that there's a lot of things that we get out of a PhD, out of our preparation in grad school, that we can kind of take for granted. And they may be very natural skills for us around research or writing or teaching or facilitating. And so we don't always think about them as what I would call like our superpowers. And those are the things that we really should be focused on, so that we can talk about how we might translate those into a grant writing position or even a ghostwriting position. Or maybe, you do an editorial role. Like, all of these things can be open to us because of the experience we have. So knowing your strengths is also really helpful when it comes to your job materials, because it allows you to communicate what your fit is for a particular position. And you can also provide really concrete examples of what you're going to be offering to an institution or an organization based on your job role. So what I want to kind of recommend that you do, especially for the cover letter, is to think about writing paragraphs in support of like specific areas of your work or your skill set. So you might have one on strategic planning, or you might have one on leadership or managing a team, or you might have one on nimbleness or resourcefulness or creativity. Like, it could be anything. But you kind of draft a bunch of these different paragraphs with concrete examples, and then you swap them in and out depending on what the job is and what the job is really emphasizing that you're a fit for. And sometimes it's better to write these paragraphs before we're looking at a job ad. Like, use it as a reflective exercise to really think about what are the things that you're bringing to any job that is something that you're really good at, and it's really a gift that you're going to be bringing to that institution or organization. And then I would also recommend creating a CV and a resume, because when you're in the alternative academic job market, you might get asked for one or both, or some kind of combination that's not what we are typically prepared to create. So having a professional website can also help, because if you're doing a resume and it's a shorter document, you might want to have more of a portfolio available that would allow people to see kind of more of your work in more detail. So that might be something else to consider if you're thinking about doing kind of a larger portfolio of work that you want people to be thinking about. All right, back over to Tom for the next question.
And thank you, Katie. Katie talked about how do you figure out what you want to do, and it can be a weird feeling to say, "Oh, I'm going to narrow things down," when the job market seems like it's already pressing on you and narrow. And so, what I want to and Visna had a good question here. Do I need to get certifications to prove I know how to do things? I'm actually going to go in a similar direction to Visna's question here, and talk a little bit about independent alt-ac work. On your screen, you see a speaker with a microphone in front of what looks like a TED Talk kind of an audience. There's a monitor off to the left and a big screen up at the front giving information and ideas. And we all kind of dream, yeah, I want to be the sage on the stage, or maybe some of us have other kinds of things we want to do. But as you're narrowing things down, also think about what's your, and I'll use some current terminology here, what's your main hustle and what's your side hustle? So for example, I go around the world now and give keynote speeches, workshops on things that deal with issues of technology and quality in higher education. And how did people know that I was an expert? Well, there's only 2 steps to people knowing you're an expert and you can speak and consult with them. 1, you tell them you're an expert. And I know that you're going to roll your eyes at that one, but when I would give a presentation at a conference, the last slide would always be, hey, I speak and consult on this, and if you'd like to continue the conversation, here's how you get a hold of me. And I would put my website up on the screen just for a couple of seconds. The other thing to do is have the bona fides to actually back it up. And that's where you have your degree work, you have your expertise, you have your job experience that helps you to put a foot in the door. I started with my speaking and consulting when I was a graduate student. And there's a lot of examples of people who are expert enough in their fields that they've got their little tiny niche and they're the expert in that thing, even though they're still working on a master's degree or a PhD. So with regard to alternative academic logistics, there's a lot of different things you can do other than speaking and consulting. If writing is your thing, put your blog out there, get in contact with places like the Chronicle of Higher Education, like Inside Higher Education, and write from your perspective. How is the COVID-19 pandemic affecting people in graduate school, affecting you, your colleagues, those things? And people want to hear those voices. So if you've got contacts, if you've got connections, that's great. But if not, send those items in to colleagues through the general websites for places like Inside Higher Ed or the Chronicle of Higher Education or EdSurge, and get part of the conversation. Make your voice become part of that conversation. The other thing in terms of consulting and speaking, those are things that you can do even before you have the degree. And it allows you to show that you are part of the larger scholarly conversation that's happening. And it really does look good to employers that you are a public scholar. One of the things that's really challenging is most PhD programs train us to be narrowly focused on jobs in faculty departments. And so the idea of the public scholar is, in many instances and many fields, kind of off to the side, or, oh, we don't do that. We're the real scholars, right? So doing that public voice, that's something that's going to pay you back. And whatever format you decide to do it in, that's going to be a useful thing. And that's a lead in to what Kevin's going to talk about now. He's going to talk about how do we translate skills from just the PhD program into being a public scholar and alternative academic.
And it's highly appropriate that Will Ferrell's on this slide because I am sometimes not as serious as I could be. But and translation can mean a number of things. Katie spoke about it in the context of knowing your superpowers and your strengths. And so that's a place to start. Really, it's about conducting an inventory of what you can do, and can-do attitude's important. So you can start with big buckets and toss everything in that looks like a skill. Don't hold back. So these skills might fall into different categories. They might be more generalizable, and we've heard both Katie and Tom talk about things like writing, but then you want to get maybe a little more granular and focus on, have you written progress reports for a lab project? Have you written grant proposals? Have you written articles for publication? Those different things are good to have listed out somewhere. Other big buckets in the generalizable skill categories might be research, where you've done things like lit reviews or conducting interviews and focus groups to collect data, or different aspects of conducting experiments in a lab environment. Presentations, as Tom mentioned, some people like to be on the stage and others have done so maybe as part of a panel. Have you managed people, whether it be a small group of lab techs or a large group for some nonprofit organization? Have you gained any technology skills, whether it be podcasting or creating a website or things like that? There are also discipline-specific skills that you may still want to consider listing in your list of things to show the world, because disciplines often offer us a new way to look at the world. So if you consider your training as a historian or a lawyer or a scientist, STEM, you have gained different ways of seeing how the world works, and that can work to your advantage. Once you get that long list of skills in a bunch of different buckets, Katie alluded to the fact that job descriptions and job ads can act as the secret decoder ring. So you start looking at the qualifications, desired qualifications or recommended responsibilities, things like that. And you'll start seeing language that you might be able to start that translation process, where you've written down on one side of your paper or on a vision board all the different things that you can do and like to do. And then here are some different things that you found, again, hearkening back to the websites I shared before, maybe the Higher Ed Recruitment Consortium or Higher Ed Job Sites or something like them, Chronicle of Higher Ed, or Inside Higher Ed, different places where you can find job postings that aren't just in the academic realm. I would also note that it's good to look for gaps so that you know what skills you want to pick up through professional development, because we are all evolving and growing. And later on in this, when we talk about our personal pathways, I'll talk about some skills that I've picked up by accident, let's say, and some I've done intentionally. And so we'll cover that in a second. But I wanted to bring up one more thing about these translatable skills, and it's partly to address Patrick Walsh's question in the chat about visibility and evidence. And so Katie mentioned preparing CVs and resumes and even personal websites as you conduct your job searches. I would add electronic portfolios to that list as a possibility for you to consider. Whether you use a WordPress site with a gallery of work samples or a more specific e-portfolio tool like Pathbright, it allows you to light up the runway for different audiences, including hiring agents, to see your work in their context. The fact that you get to write a reflection about what this work product means for people who might be hiring, as opposed to what it meant when you conducted that experiment or worked with that nonprofit organization. It allows you to make that pivot, that translation, as you show your best self to the people who are hiring. So with that, I think we are set. We are ready to tell some stories around the campfire and see where we go from here.
All right, so we had one kind of final question that we thought we would answer from each of our perspectives, and then we want to do an open call for questions from folks who are here in the live session. And so this final question is really just about how people go about doing alternative academic careers, because there's lots of different ways to come into this work. And we had a lot of questions around this about just like, how does this work? How do you do it? And we all have a slightly different story here. So I'm going to just mention that of all the strategies that I've heard today that we've already talked about, one of the approaches that I've always taken with my own career in alternative academic work is a mindset of consistent growth and an awareness of just being open to new experiences. So in grad school, this meant working with a writing across the curriculum program. I worked with a Center for Teaching and Learning. Post-grad school, I actively worked on sharpening my grant writing skills, my quantitative literacy skills, how to manage a team, how to manage a budget. I started building a public speaking career. I started writing and publishing books, starting a side business. I became a certified coach. I learned about podcasting and website building. I mean, it's just kind of following the things that are interesting to me, but also where I saw gaps and where I saw potential places where I could make a contribution from the unique kind of constellation of the skills that I was building together. I would also say every time I went on the job market, I really was clear about my values. And those are looking for things like autonomy and independence and creativity in my jobs. And I've looked for those things in every position that I've applied for. So really having a clear sense of what you can do, what you care about, what you want to learn about, and then what that contribution is to your next organization or institution, I think is a really important step of building an alternative academic career. All right, Kevin, do you want to go next?
Absolutely. And just along the same lines as what Katie just shared, my own path in the alternative academic scene has been circuitous, let's say, but as I moved forward, I started doing things more intentionally. And that would be one piece of advice I would share for people just getting started, or people who may even be in different stages of their careers, is to start being more intentional and purposeful about the different tasks that you complete, the different skills that you pick up, and the different jobs that you approach. And so similarly, you know, I took a grant writing class in my master's program in order to support something I wanted to do as a preschool teacher at the time. It led to writing a U.S. Department of Education grant that I co-directed and really changed my entire, it took a left turn, let's say, at Albuquerque, as Bugs Bunny did. And so then I ended up doing professional development for faculty and K-12 teachers, leading units and managing budgets. And ultimately that paved the way for me to be able to lead startups, startup efforts through nationwide organizations and more. And so being open to opportunities, as Tom brought up, the whole aspect of keeping your network finely tuned and seeking new connections and diverse connections, because the more diverse our connections are, the more opportunities we will have access to. Those are all important aspects of an alternative academic career. And with that, I'll hand it over to Tom to close us out.
Thank you. And like you heard in Katie's story and Kevin's story, none of our paths have been straight lines, and none of our paths have gone exactly where we've planned them. And so having that openness to whatever comes next is really a key here. And before we get into an open question and answer with everybody, and I want to make sure that we have plenty of time for that, I just want to share one thing. I was one of the crazy people who went through grade school, middle school, and high school. Then 4 years later, I had an undergraduate degree. 2 years later, I had a master's degree. And 4 years later, I had a PhD. So I was 28 and had a doctorate and wasn't real sure how to do the laundry yet. And that meant that I was really at a crossroads. I didn't know what I wanted to do. I had a PhD and I was like, oh, am I ready for a big real thing that's got consequences to it? And I actually went back to school and got another master's degree in library and information sciences, because I recognized that the doctorate that I had pursued had prepared me to have a tiny little narrow slice of a job. And those jobs just didn't exist by the time I got out and had my PhD. What I did after I got through with my schooling is I actually went into industry. A friend of mine recommended going into Blue Cross and Blue Shield. I went into the health insurance business, and they have a learning and development arm. They need to do training for everybody who picks up a phone when you have a question about your health insurance, or a doctor or a hospital wants to check on care. I happened to get into that the year before the Affordable Care Act changed all the rules for health insurance. And because I had database management skills, because I could write well, because I was used to working with other folks in a collaborative team, I had a lot of opportunities to grow at Blue Cross and Blue Shield in a way that I never would have had I struck with a traditional academic path. And that's where I got my project management certification. That's where I really learned how to work in teams with other people instead of being a lone person out there just doing my own thing. And when I came back into higher education after a few years, it actually made me much more marketable. It allowed me to look at and find other opportunities. So the message that we all want to share with everybody is, keep your ears open, keep your eyes open. And I'm going to turn it back over to Kevin, who's going to facilitate our question and answer period. We do have two of them that have already come in, and I want to surface both of those, and then we'll ask for all of your ideas and questions in the chat. Maria asked about, she wants to go into publishing and editing, and what are some good resources to look at there. So that's one thing we can consider. And Barb asked, do we have to be so entrepreneurial? I'm not sure I need to be or want to be such an entrepreneur. What about people like me? So those are two seeds that we can work from. I'll turn it over to Kevin to facilitate, and we'll start thinking about those questions.
Great. Well, do you want to tackle either of those, Tom, while we get started? I mean, I have ideas about entrepreneurialism, but the one about publishing might be a good one to start.
I was going to say, if you want to tackle the entrepreneur one, please go ahead.
Then let's do that. So I would say there is no one size fits all. And so alt-acts come in all shapes and sizes and colors and dimensions. And so there are some of us that are entrepreneurial and are starting our own businesses and seeking different opportunities that might be a little bit less stable in certain economies. And for instance, right now, my wife and I both run our own businesses. So that means we are responsible for something that Tom just brought up, insurance and other factors that play into how much I have to work in order to pay all the bills and keep the lights on. But many alt-ac positions fit within the confines of stable positions at organizations around the country and around the world. So it's not necessary that you have to be an entrepreneur. You might be a little entrepreneurial or think outside the box in terms of where you apply. I might say that, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you need to take bigger risks or be prepared to be long periods of time without income coming in. The job market is fluid, but there are lots of positions out there, especially for those of us who have experience with online teaching right now. That's going to be a skill set that will make you a strong candidate either in the lecturer teaching space or in supporting professional development for instructors who've never done it before. So I will stop there and see what other things my colleagues have to say.
Thank you, Katie. Do you have ideas on the publishing question from Maria?
I do. So I'm going to drop a link into the chat for a book called What Editors Do, which I think is a really helpful book to try to differentiate the different parts of the publishing industry if you're coming from an editorial perspective. I will say that there is a real gap right now, especially in the academic space, for developmental editors. And these are the editors who think kind of more about structural level work across disciplines. I have clients all the time who are looking for developmental editors, and every time I send them to somebody I know, they're fully booked. I mean, like, this is an area that I think people just really have a need for. So I do think that there's a lot of possibilities here of what you can do. The book, What Editors Do, in the back of it includes a bunch of resources on editorial training programs that are sometimes continuing ed programs or summer programs or virtual programs where you can get a kind of credential basically that says you've been trained as an editor. So if that's something you're really called to do, I think there's a lot of possibilities there for how to get that credentialing and that extra learning. So that's one book I would start with that I think is kind of a helpful resource. There's quite a bit about the publishing industry outside of higher ed if you're looking in those spaces. But this is also an area where I would highly recommend doing informational interviews with editors from maybe a couple different publishing areas. And if you need connections there, feel free to communicate with me privately, because there's several editors I've worked with who I'm sure would be happy to talk with you.
And Katie, Sharon's just asking, can you say the name of the book again? Yeah,
the book is called What Editors Do. And I think it came out of Chicago Press. It's an edited collection. So it has a lot of different perspectives in it.
Great. We've got a couple other ones here. Sharon's asking about having a background in adult education and working her way over toward the learning and development industry. And she also asked about Quality Matters and that kind of certification. I can take that real quick. Katie has already dropped a link into the chat for you to the Association of Training and Development. It used to be the ASTD, and then it was ATD, and now it's just TD. But they're a really great organization. They've got a great job board, and it's a way for you to see what people do in learning and development in industry that isn't higher education. So that would be a wonderful place to start on that. And as well, if you've got that adult education background, you've already got 90% of the skills that somebody's going to want in a learning and development organizational situation. There's also a couple of other quick follow-ups here. Patrick's asking, can you explain developmental editors? I think, Kevin, you mentioned that real quick.
I mentioned that, and I'm going to drop a link into the chat.
Oh, my bad. Okay. Sorry about that. James Larson says, what advice do you have for PhD students in their last year trying to navigate both the academic and alt-ac job markets simultaneously?
Well, I can jump in and say it just requires being flexible in how you present yourself. Again, I like to use the phrase lighting up the runway for the people who are the audience of your of what you're putting out there. So as Katie mentioned, having both a CV and a resume means that you'll be more flexible when people ask you for specific information about your background and your experience. But it just means that you may be doing more of that translating that we talked about earlier, especially because you may be translating some skills that weren't discipline specific back into the academic side of the house. And so just being a little bit flexible and being ready for anything is the way to get started when you're not quite sure which pathway you want to take.
Awesome. A question from Rachel. This is a good one. Can you talk about how to navigate being both over and underqualified at the start of your ALTAC career? ALTAC jobs don't require PhDs, many of them, so having one can be tricky. We have lots of skills, but we don't have lots of experience within that particular space. I can actually.
Well, I think, go ahead.
I was going to say, I can actually jump in on that one real quick.
Do it.
And what I've done is I've been the overqualified person with the PhD going for a job that doesn't require it. And if anybody ever asks, well, you have this PhD, I say it honestly. I say, I've got a doctorate in these particular skills, and that means that I will eventually make a wonderful manager, supervisor, director for your organization. At the same time, I really need to start where I want to start so that I can get the skills, learn on the job. And you're making an investment, not just in this hire, but you're making an investment for a longer term, for a career. It's something that I want to establish. And that conversation has always gone well for me. So, you know, be honest about where you want to be, but also be honest about what that PhD gives that person that they're hiring you for that's beyond what they're just hiring for. And let's see. Lowe says, seems easier to look at job descriptions, say you wouldn't want that job, but more difficult to say exactly what you're looking for. Do you think it's better to define what you want or keep an open mind?
I can take that one because I feel like every time I go on the job market, I'm like, I don't really know what I want. I don't know the position title I want. I don't know. I mean, sometimes I don't even know the part of the country I'm looking in. So I think that for me, it's kind of been I know it when I see it. And it's been more important for me to know what am I looking for and what are the things that are the most priority for me. So the last time I went on the market, I was looking for strong leadership because I really wanted to have someone that I could learn from who I was directly reporting to. So that was an important thing for me. It was also important for me to think about growing in a new direction. I didn't want the same job I had before. I wanted something different and potentially in more of a leadership strategy position than what I had before. So those kinds of things were what allowed me to kind of be open to a range of different possibilities. But like I said, I only applied to one job and then I got it. Like I kind of knew what I was looking for and I was looking for a really good fit and it just happened to come along. So I think that that's the kind of thing that when you have a job, you can be kind of picky about that. I know we're not all in that position when we're on the market. But I think that sometimes you feel your way in even through interviewing to know if it's a good fit for you and your skills and what you can offer.
Splendid. And we've got a couple of comments here and suggestions from people. I want to surface those. Sarah Schley says, if you're emailing brand new in your network folks, be short and specific. Say you're contacting them because of their expertise in this. So you've recognized they recognize you've done your homework and you'd like to talk to them for 20 minutes about why. Be short and specific. So excellent idea there. And Catherine Harris is saying, just a comment, faculty development is a great alt-act career. She's a center director and she looks for people who are participatory in programming and then invites them to help facilitate center programming. We're coming up close to the end of our time here. So let's surface one more or two more questions here. Marissa's asking, she's usually reaching out to people through mutual connections, but what suggestions can you give for contacting people cold during this time when networking is difficult? And email is someone, email from someone you don't know is easy to ignore.
Well, I can share an experience I just had, which lines up with that question. And I can also give some ideas about social networking sites like LinkedIn. If you're familiar with social networks, we have what are called strong ties or strong connections and some weaker ones where we might be acquaintances rather than strong friends or colleagues, people who've worked together for 10 or 15 years. And so leveraging people who might be what LinkedIn refers to as a second level connection or a third level connection can be a way for you to make those connections with people with whom you want to speak. So reaching out to someone you know and say, hey, could you make an introduction to so-and-so for me? And then it might be, hey, I'm trying to get somebody down the chain. So can you introduce me to so-and-so, who will then introduce me to a different so-and-so? But in some cases, it's just a matter of striking up conversations with experts or people who are doing things that you really admire. If you're familiar with the work by Kundu and his writings about student agency, I made a reference to it in a podcast interview and then tweeted about it, thanking him for all of his great work. And he reached out to me. I was really pleased to get in contact with him, and now he and I are writing back and forth. And so it might be as simple as recognizing work that people have done, and along the lines of what Sarah Schley advised is like, hey, I'm interested in this particular aspect of your work. I really admire what you've done. Do you have any recommendations? They might say, hey, I don't have a lot of time right now. Or they might say, hey, I've got time, 15 minutes for a quick coffee talk by phone. So I would say don't hesitate to reach out. A lot of people might be more willing to open up than you might suspect.
Well, an hour goes by really quickly, and we've been able to touch on a lot of general strategies and a few specific ones. We want to say thank you to everybody who's been here on the live call and to everybody who's been watching the recordings. We'd like to invite you to go to this web address, which is bit.ly/altac64, because today is June 4th. And we'd love to have your thoughts on where should we go now? Should we do more of these kind of sessions? Should we hold some workshops? We're open to how we create more community and how we do good with the stuff that we've put together, as well as how do we connect one another, not just the three of us, but everybody who's in this community now. So we'd encourage you, please go to that website. Jennifer Polk is Johnny on the spot here. She just put it into the chat, so you can just copy that and paste it into your web browser when you have a moment. We'd love to hear your thoughts on what we do next, and we'd like to go that way. To wrap up, though, we have a little bit of a bonus for everybody. On the screen, of course, you see the book. If you don't have a copy of the book and you haven't read it, no problem. You are definitely welcome to be part of our community. But if you do want a copy, free shipping and 30% off if you go to styluspub.presswarehouse.com, and you can save that with code ALT30. And watch in the next day or two. We'll be emailing 5 of you. You've just won an e-copy of the book thanks to Stylus Press. So thank you to Stylus Press for making those copies available. We'll be going through the list of everybody who was here on the live session, and 5 of you just won a book. And if you want to continue the conversation with us, our websites are on the screen: drkatielinder.com, tiny.cc/Kevin Kelly, and thomasjtobin.com. Of course, we're here to help you. We'd love to hear your story, and I've got 20 minutes for everybody, and I know my co-authors do as well. So thank you, everybody, for being part of this open conversation, and thank you to Stylus Press for sponsoring it. And we're grateful to be part of your community now, and we hope that you'll be part of a community for each other. So thanks, everybody, for coming on board, and we'll see you soon. Bye, everybody.
I see a quick note about the recording and the chat, and we will go ahead and send out both. So if you are having a hard time following the chat, or there were resources in there you want to see later, we can attach that when we send out the recording to everybody later. So go ahead and look for that. Also saw a couple people come in right at the end. Maybe there was a time zone difference going on there. So if you missed the session, we will be sending out the recording probably in the next 24 to 48 hours. And we welcome you to follow up with any questions that you might have. Thanks, everybody.